Going.
Okay.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the Gordon Parks Museum and Fort Scott Community College Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Virtual Lunch and Learn event. My name is Kirk Sharp. I'm the director of the Gordon Parks Museum. Today, we're pleased to welcome Carmaletta Williams for her presentation, Free Did Not Mean Welcome. Our program is brought to us by Humanities Kansas, an independent nonprofit spearheading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. Carmaletta earned her master's in English from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and her doctorate from the University of Kansas. Although she retired from a successful teaching career from Johnson Community College, Carmaletta still writes and edits for Williams Publishing Group, LLC. She is a published author for both creative writing and scholarly writing, and one of her most remarkable books is titled Langston Hughes in the Classroom, Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me. She is now the executive director of the Black Archives of Mid-America. I'm very honored and excited to introduce to you Carmaletta Williams. Welcome, Carmaletta. Thank you for being here today with us.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Kirk. This is great.
Yes, it is fun. We're excited about this. And just want to remind everybody there will be opportunity to have a Q&A questions toward the end of Carmaletta's presentation. And it's just a monumental day for us to have this discussion, especially what's going on around the world. And so we just want to continue our celebrations of Martin Luther King Jr. and his fight for freedom. So Carmaletta, I'll go ahead and let you begin.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's needed now more than ever, I think. So this presentation is an adaptation of one that I've done previously for the Humanities Council. That was Free Did Not Mean Welcome. And Kirk has asked me to talk about systemic racism. So I have expanded it and altered it quite a bit. This is who I am. I'm executive director of the Black Archives of Mid-America in Kansas City. If you have not been here, please come. It's a beautiful facility and it is full of important information. Okay, the Negro, Arthur Schomburg tells us, must remake his past before he can begin to make his future. Jacob Lawrence says that uprooting yourself from one way of life to make your way in another involves conflict and struggle, but out of the struggle comes a kind of power and even beauty. Frederick Douglass says, the dreams of my childhood and the purposes of my manhood were now fulfilled. A free state around me and a free earth under my feet. What a moment was this for me. The desire to walk freely in a free land as a free person has long been the dream of enslaved people. Ever since, quote, Africa was the privileged hunting ground of Europe and America, and the flag of different nations hung a sign of death on the coast of Congo and Guinea, the idea of freedom and being free has been deeply embedded in the psyche of Black people in the United States. Those first shackled steps taken by Africans packed like animals in the hulls of slave ships and brought to the United States as slaves were filled with the hope that one day those chains would break and those people would walk the land free to come and go as they pleased. Only a few of those first captives ever walked free. Those that did were like Bascom Wade's nameless wife and Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, and the legendary Ebo, whom Paul Marshall so wonderfully describes in Praise Song for the Widow. Bascom Wade's wife, whose name no one can remember, but whose legacy no one will ever forget, could never be freed because she had never truly been a slave. However, she got tired of being owned, even if her husband had only been able to, quote, lay claim to her body, but not her mind, end quote. She knew that her husband would not relinquish that claim. She secured freedom for her children, and she had refused to let him own her mind. But one day she got tired of having her body owned, and without fanfare or even a farewell, she simply walked to the edge of the West Bluff and went home to Africa. Naylor doesn't privilege her readers to know if Mrs. Wade flew home. like the flying Africans in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, where she simply walked back over the Atlantic. We only know that she got tired of being owned and of not owning anything, so she just returned home to Africa, the place where she was never owned. The Igbo and praise song also would not be owned, so they just turned and walked away. When they touched ground on this American land, they walked off the ships, blinked at the sun, looked around, and saw the future. They saw, quote, the slavery time and the war, the emancipation and everything after that, right on up to the hard times today, end quote. The Igbo gave the white slavers, quote, the same hard, long look as they had given their past and their future. And then, without saying a word, they just turned and walked on back down to the edge of the river. They just kept walking right on out over the river. When they got to where the ships was, they didn't so much as give it a look. Just walked on past it. Didn't want nothing to do with that old ship. Their feet was going to take them wherever they was going that day. And they was singing by then. When they realized there wasn't nothing between them and home but some water, and that wasn't giving them no trouble, they got so tickled they started to singing. That was Igbo just up and walked on away not 2 minutes after getting here. The Igbo walked over the river across the Atlantic to Africa. They went back home singing. Although authors provide hope for the attainment of freedom for their characters, historical documents reveal that few enslaved people ever made it back home. My ancestors did not have the magical, mythical powers that would have allowed them to fly or walk back home to Africa. For them, as far as almost everyone else who was enslaved in this country, there was no home. The land they had been taken from was gone. Mother Africa had been ravaged of hundreds of thousands, some records even say millions, of her children. She lay far away from those who survived, so many unidentifiable miles away on the other end of the Atlantic Ocean. Except for a few of those Africans who were brought to the Americas to be enslaved, most did not have the power or opportunity to just turn and leave. But the action of walking away from those people and elements who would attempt to keep their bodies and their minds in captive, restricted, malign state became paramount in the psyche of those Africans. It continues today. Time, circumstance, and the relative absence of historical memory have blurred the lines that would allow us no choice except for the Africans in the no choice except for Africans in the diaspora to identify themselves simply as that, Africans on the other side of the Atlantic. There has to be some recognition that the conditions that caused the Igbo, Baskin-Wade's wife, and the flying Africans simply to go back home and not be owned in African remained in those people from those first steps on diasporic soil to the trudge into bondage and through slavery, until finally millions of African Americans walked away from the South after emancipation. They were looking for a new place free from bondage and mistreatment that they could call home. They looked for freedom, the freedom that emancipation did not provide for them in the South. Zora Neale Hurston reminds us that freedom is a delicate instrument. It's like a cemetery flower. It's rooted in struggle and nourished in blood. Institutional racism, the use of social, political, economic, and violent control of others because of their race, was not new. It had emerged in the form of slavery for those first African people and has continually asserted itself in other ways, in other de jure by law, but largely as de facto by action. Racial restrictions imposed on Black people. Institutionalized racism has made this walk to self-agency a very difficult, but not impossible one for Black people. Many emancipated Black folk recognized that enough of their people had struggled long and hard and had shed so much blood on this soil that they were unwilling to give any more to the neo-slavery enveloping them in the South. This new form of slavery was a severe form of institutional racism, the crop lien system, better known as sharecropping. There could no longer be master-slave legal relationships. So essentially, the control of the South's labor force came in a new form. This control also came with agents of fear, the so-called bulldozers and night riders. Racial terror was the backbone of institutional racism. Make them fear you and you can control them. But Black people had already experienced fear and learned that they could survive attempts to break their spirits and control their lives and their families. They did not just sit down and accept the attitudes of others, read whites, to define their actions and their lives. Instead, they packed up their families and their lives and headed to places that at once represented freedom. Those journeys were not easy. Violence, including murder, often found those who left. For some of those people attempting to leave the systems of racism that endangered their lives, it meant a journey to the north, to Canada, or to the west and the Midwest, particularly to Kansas, a free state. Those people put their faith in the promise applied in the Appalachian. They became exodusters, fashioned after the biblical story of the Israelites who escaped bondage in Egypt by leaving with an exodus. These newly freed people were looking for a place to call home and thought they could find it in Kansas. However, they quickly came to realize that for Black people in Kansas, free did not mean welcome. Post-emancipation, but in the shadows of antebellum debates about the place of Blacks in Kansas's social fabric, my great-grandfather Frank Taylor from Alabama and my great-great-grandfather Robert Wilson from Tennessee would find themselves immersed in a rather hostile world. Despite John Brown's freedom fights and a few postbellum charitable efforts to rescue the exodusters from destitution and despair, Kansans, on the whole, were unwilling to embrace the Black pursuit of freedom and literacy, at least on Kansas soil. For the migrant, this world was no doubt one of contradiction, conflict, and uncertainty. What to do with Negroes, or as W.B. Du Bois, among so many, so aptly named it, the Negro question, was not of critical importance to the Republicans who had taken control of Kansas. Most Negroes in the territory, however, should have felt some type of affinity with what Du Bois says is the unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem? What to do with Black people projected to come to the area, as well as those already in the territory, was a real problem for the Republican legislatures, one they would have preferred not to debate. However, their acceptance of the Free State mandate warranted serious discussion of this issue at the Free State Conventions held at Big Springs and at Topeka in 1855. Most of the conferees felt that there were more important questions to address, like how to create a free state political party. They wanted to focus on issues like establishing a system of securing liberty and self-determination for themselves. They were forced, however, to spend a considerable amount of time discussing means of, quote, disenthralling themselves from the slavery which was now fettering them, end quote. The only way to do this, they decided, was not to interact with Negroes at all. They then established a racial exclusion system when they resolved that, quote, the best interests of Kansas require a population of free white men. And that in our state organization, we are in favor of stringent laws excluding all Negroes, bond or free, from the territory. The decision was expedient, to be sure, but it was also deeply rooted in racism. 50 years before Booker T. Washington urged Negroes to cast down their buckets where they could remain as separate as the fingers of the hand, Kansans had made the same determination. They would not interact with Negroes, enslaved or free, socially or politically. At the Topeka conference, the issue was confronted and addressed again. Institutional racist systems were put in place. Negroes were excluded from voting, holding office, or serving in the military. The conferees passed a referendum on Negro exclusion by a 3-to-1 margin, demonstrating the overwhelming anti-Negro sentiment of the whole. In a proclamation that also included mulattoes, the Topeka Conference issued a proclamation signed by the executive committee. It said, quote, "The qualified electors of the territory expressed their approval of the passage of laws providing for the exclusion of free Negroes from Kansas," end quote. Those white legislators had essentially claimed the land as belonging only to them, only to white people. Nearly 50 years later, Du Bois took exception to that attitude, which still prevailed. He said, "Your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we have brought our 3 gifts and mingled them with yours, the gift of story and song, soft, stirring melody in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land, the gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your weak hands could have done. The third, a gift of the spirit. Would America have been America without her Negro people?" McDowell and John Greer, a Republican from Topeka, argued stringently for elimination of Negroes from Kansas or strict segregation of those who stayed. Greer argued that it would be a, quote, "extravagant mistake to mix the races socially or in schools. White children," he argued, "should not be exposed to Negroes because of the, quote, consequences growing out of a mixture of races," end quote. Besides, he argued, quote, "association governs conduct. I am opposed to giving the Negro and mulatto either the political privilege or the social privileges which we claim for ourselves," end quote. They claimed every political, social, and economic privilege for themselves. Public sentiment ran strongly segregationist. In 1861, the state legislature enacted legislation that allowed district school superintendents of education the right to establish separate schools for Negroes and whites. There was no equal, either implied or explicit. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision that established the doctrine of separate but equal was not enacted for another 37 years. Through referendum to legislate, though the legislators were able to establish a system that controlled the access to public accommodations for Negroes already in Kansas. Restricting the immigration of free blacks to Kansas would have to be handled in a different manner. Richard Cordley of Lawrence asserted the futility of these debates on restricting Negro access in Kansas. He said, "Negroes are not coming. They're here. They will stay here. They are American born. They've been here for more than 250 years. They're not going to South America. They're not going to other parts of our own land. They are with us to stay. They are to be our neighbors, whatever we may think about it, whatever we may do about it," end quote. Endless hours of debate on the issue would have little impact on the reality. Not only were Negroes already in the territory, many more were coming for a myriad of reasons. Kansas Senator James Lane, without authorization and against instructions from Washington, began recruiting a large contingent of Negroes into the territory to serve in the Union ranks as early as 1861. Several thousand enslaved, escaped people sought solace in the territory between 1860 and 1862. Corley's pronouncement was right. They are here. In order to avoid establishing specific Black laws, the conferees handled the Negro question by public referendum. They set a system of institutionalized racism. Although there were laws giving exclusive privilege to white men, no laws specifically disenfranchising Blacks existed. None was needed. On March 6, 1857, 3 years after the first of Thayer's settlers from the New England Immigrant Aid Company founded the town of Lawrence, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had been taken to Illinois, a free state, from Missouri, a slave state, and then into Wisconsin Territory, which was free under the terms of the Missouri Compromise. Scott lived in these free territories for over 5 years. His owner then took him back to Missouri. Members of the family that had once owned Scott befriended him on his return. They helped him with his case to prove that because he had lived so long in free states, he should be free. A lower court ruled that indeed Scott should be free. The case was overturned on appeal. Finally, the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's decision regarding Scott made 2 points abundantly clear. 1, the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and 2, the enslaved were property, not people with rights. Charles Johnson and Patricia Smith succinctly summarized the effect of Judge Taney's work. They say, the decision confirmed the entire experience of Black people since the founding of the nation. Only now, the humiliation was official. The court declared that Scott, and by extension all enslaved persons, were not citizens of the United States or even the state of Missouri, and by extension Kansas, and they therefore had no right to sue in court. The court continued in its pronouncements and determined that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress had no power to exclude slavery from the territories. The court based this decision on the Fifth Amendment, which prohibited Congress from depriving any person of, quote, property without due process of law, end quote. The justices recognized that simply to outwardly declare slavery the law of the land would have sounded a death knell to the survival of the United States. Their decision, instead, essentially granted sovereignty to each state to decide whether that state would be slave or free. Abolitionists were severely upset and disappointed with the Dred Scott decision. The court's ruling that Congress had no right to ban slavery anywhere in the United States, not that it ever would, signaled a wide emanation of slavery throughout the territories. Their reaction, according to Frederick Douglass, came from a new form of abolitionism. He said, opposing slavery and hating its victims has become a very common form of abolitionism. They beat colored men on their thresholds and say, we care not how temperate and industrious you may be. We want none of you here. This is a government of white men. Systemic racism was firmly in place. The Dred Scott decision gave Kansans all the latitude they needed to feel justified to keep Blacks, whether free or enslaved, from the territory. In 1852, the United States Supreme Court's ruling in this case made it abundantly clear that the U.S. Constitution was written for the protection and interest of white men only. Justice Taney's ruling in that decision set the attitudes that would foster and nurture the racism in this country, which continues to this present day. The Supreme Court, in decreeing the inferiority of Negroes, gave Kansas more fuel for its segregationist father. Negroes, Taney declared, in fact, quote, had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in school or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well. A Negro of the African race was regarded as an article of property and held and bought and sold as such in every one of the 13 colonies which united in the Declaration of Independence and afterward formed the Constitution of the United States. The slaves were more or less numerous in the different colonies, as slave labor was found more or less profitable. But no one seems to have doubted the correctness of the prevailing opinion of the time. End quote. Judge Taney's declaration of Negro inferiority and lack of rights provided the narrow-minded judicial platitudes on which the legislators in the Kansas Territory would ground their biased ideology. The white man in Kansas certainly did not respect the Negro or feel bound to honor any of the Negro's rights. However, with or without Taney's pronouncement, the legislature's attitude of exclusion was already in place. Kansans wrestled with the dilemma of how to frame their argument and thus structure the law regarding blacks, especially slaves in the state. The citizenry was divided almost 2-1 by the slightest allowable margin, 1 vote. The legislature decided to disenfranchise Negroes in the territory. They also laid to rest the question of whether to be a free or slave state. In July 1859, Section 6 of the Bill of Rights of the Wyandotte Constitution declared that except for, quote, crimes, end quote, of an unspecified nature, there would be no slavery or involuntary servitude in the state of Kansas. The decision was completely self-serving. The legislators appropriated the land that had been promised to the Indians for personal profit and wanted it unencumbered by slaves or the slavery issue. The Emancipation Proclamation had reluctantly been signed by President Abraham Lincoln. Black people were leaving the South in unprecedented numbers. Many heard through postings by Exodus conductor Pap Singleton that Kansas was the place to be. After all, the deed was done. The vote had been cast. The word went out. Kansas was a free state. However, the word about African American disenfranchisement and social ostracism in the state didn't reach migrating Negroes like Papa Frank and Grandpa Wilson, who were looking for a new home and found it in Kansas. They had a free state around them and a free earth under their feet. They were those people that the fictional conductor in the Migration Railroad, Ned, wrote about in a letter to his adopted mother, Miss Jane Pittman, in the Ernest J. Gaines novel, The Autobiography of Miss Pittman. Miss Jane reveals the information in Ned's post to her. She said, "The letter told how people was coming into Kansas by the boatload. At first, how the white people in Kansas was helping them, how they collected money to give them, how they organized committees to go to Washington and places like that for money and clothes, money and food. Even from across the sea, they got money and clothes. The people at first was almost too nice, but that was the first letter." End quote. Those African Americans who moved to the state on the power of the promise implied in the name didn't know that the political and social climates were grounded in animosity towards blacks, and they did indeed struggle. The system of institutionalized racism continues to this day. African Americans still counter racial restrictions instituted when J.C. Nichols developed the system of redlining financial maps to exclude financing African American homes and businesses, an action legalized by the City Council of Kansas City in 1920s. Disparities in healthcare were fought against by African American healthcare professionals and with the creation of Black hospitals. Yet African Americans have contracted and are dying from COVID-19 at an exponential rate of whites. The 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision ingrained in much of the white community that Black and white people should remain separate but equal, with extreme racist underpinnings that convinced many whites that they were better than Blacks. School systems educating Black children operating under the separate but equal system did an amazing job of teaching literacy to African Americans of all age, but they suffered from loss of finances. The two Brown v. Board of Education decisions began the process of desegregating schools. However, the tax systems did not favor African American children. Those schools were and still are seriously underfunded. Those systems of racism remain stringently in place. We witness many of those racist attitudes as political representatives and white nationalists resorted to violence to devalue the Black vote, indeed, to erase it. The actions of hatred and violence on January 6, 2021, when armed mobs feeling privileged by the racial infrastructures in place in the United States and promoted by the president, forced their way into the Capitol to alter the will of the people. We must keep walking. We must walk as those first Africans did as they planted their feet or took wings back home. We must march as thousands of African Americans did as they left the neo-slavery enveloping them in the South. We must keep walking like the hundreds of Blacks who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to declare they would not be subverted by racism. We must fight systemic racism that hinders our health care, relegates some of our children to a less than adequate educational system, poisons our water, and tries to deny our vote. All of us, Black, white, Latinx, Native, and those of diverse nationalities from around the world must destroy those systems of institutional racism. We do it by saying enough, it ends here and now. We do it by accepting each other as equals. We do it by making sure equity in financial, social, housing, educational, and healthcare access is provided to all people. We do it by voting and holding our elected officials to account. We get it done by accepting that those old systems of racial restrictions were wrong-headed and unfair. Then we walk into a new day of social justice and equity for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmaletta. That was wonderful. That really brought everything back together once again, and it seems like we continue to fight the same things. I'm having some problems with my video, looks like. Seems like we're continuing to fight the same fights that we've been fighting from the beginning with the systemic racism. And it's just come at a time when we need to continue to learn from our history to improve, to make a future possible, to continue with equality for all. I think we might have one question here. I don't know if you see that, but Jeannie Klein asked, what are your views on reparations?
I think reparations are appropriate. You cannot institute a system of financial, economic, social, educational restrictions on a people that system is designed to hold them back and not pay for that. You have got to make some kind of a restitution. And it can be financial, it can be in increased schools. School districts are still having terrible times. It doesn't have to be a direct check, but there has to be some kind of restitution made.
Okay. I think there's another message. I think there's a few of them that says thank you and very good, in case you didn't see that. But is there any other questions out there for Carmaletta?
There's one.
Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Let's see. What can be done, Tim Sweeney? What can be done in Kansas and Missouri to get the full history of each state taught in public schools? That's a great question. Of course, you can share this presentation. I can share this presentation with people. But I think it's important. I got all of this information from the Historical Society, the State Historical Society, and from repositories. So it's not a secret, just that the research has to be done to make it accessible and available. I think every junior high and high school student needs to know the history of Kansas.
I agree. They need to know and to teach the history of how it's beginning because we're repeating it. If we don't learn from a history, as we all can see, we're doomed to repeat, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're repeating it in volumes now. I think there's another. I think there's another question. If you don't see that yet, Carmaletta's question is, what specific ways can we stop systemic racism in Kansas City?
You have to confront those people. Kansas City, I have seen recently make some bold steps towards that. And some of them are minor steps, like taking the name off the J.C. Nichols fountain. I mean, what action, what step did more to malign and hinder the advancement of Black people than J.C. Nichols' actions? And he didn't just do it in Kansas City. I mean, he went to Washington and shared his ideas. So it's happened nationally. We can't honor those people anymore. Also, if you have connections to people who have access to funding, people who own banks or mortgage companies or manufacturing companies, then talk to them and convince them that they have to change their mode of operation to be more inclusive.
Okay, we have another question. Is Kansas history still taught in 7th grade in Kansas? And that I'm not familiar with what the education curriculum is myself. So
yeah, I don't know.
I just do know that here at Fort Scott that they are working on history here at the high school level to even local history here is being taught. And they are diversifying that history through the history department here. They're doing a wonderful job with that. But other than that, I'm not sure about the local curriculum here, what is and what isn't being taught.
But we have to be vigilant with that history and how it's taught. And just a few short years ago, maybe 5 years ago, the state of Kansas, state of Texas adopted a history book that made no mention of slavery. How can you not talk about slavery in Texas? And they adopted that. Every elementary school student or whoever got that book saw no mention of slavery. And when I was teaching African American studies at the college, which is a PWI, predominantly white institution, every semester students would say, how come I didn't learn this in high school? And I would tell them, because you have to look at who puts out the information, who's writing these books. And and many times it's people who are hiding their place in history or shading it or cloaking it so that it doesn't look as bad. Who's printing the books? And those people are going to be concerned about getting their money back and making a profit. So they're going to make sure that those books will sell. And they know who their audience is, who they're selling it to. And it's those same people who don't want the truth out. As they say on all the cop shows, follow the money. Pretty much that's what we have to do, but we have to stand up against it. And we have to say, no, we want our children to be taught true and accurate histories of our area, of our country. And so don't cloak this, tell the truth.
One of the chat questions in the chats mentioned something about today yet free but not welcome. Is that the same question for Fort Scott? And for the Fort Scott perspective, racism is everywhere. Even still here in Fort Scott too as well. Y'all don't think you can escape, unfortunately, anywhere, racism. And even though we're free, all humans and everyone's free, but you're going to have people of hate and ignorance around everywhere. And I think there's quite a few people are like that from time. But the good thing is there's a majority of folks out there who think completely different. One other questions through the C is, can you address how Black History Month came about and how you feel about this effort?
I think it's important that Black history exists. I have a friend who's a media guru who says, I just want you to know I'm going to start lobbying for the elimination of Black history. I said, then you're going to lose my friendship. Because Blackness and Black history has so long been invisible in our culture that we have to make steps. If we didn't have a Black History Month, there would be no put into illuminating the history of people of color in this country. Same thing with other cultures. With Women's History Month, women now have broken through glass ceilings in so many occasions, but they had to do that. They had to put themselves out front and say, okay, look at what we've done, Latinas and others. You have to have that. I think that's important. I think it came about because of the invisibility of Black life and culture, and I think it needs to remain. See, there's a question from anonymous attendee about recent articles in the Kansas City Star. I was very fortunate to have been asked by the Star to write an opinion piece. So it's there. And I thought, well, I'm pretty bold in my writing, so they may not ask me again. But I think to acknowledge the racism that has been perpetuated against people of color and their overt actions in that, I think that's a bold statement, bold step, and I'm really proud of them for doing that. I'm also proud of them for slamming Josh Hawley. You know, so long these people have been protected because of their whiteness. And now it's time to just tell the truth. Let's tell the truth. Let's be direct. And that way, I think then you protect the respectability that comes with journalism. When I was doing, it's a long time ago, research for my dissertation, I read a lot of newspapers. I read a lot of Black newspapers. And in Alabama, where my great-grandfather was from, I read a lot of the local papers. And I was just amazed at the reporting. And then to recognize that happened right here in Kansas City. That racism is perpetuated in the stories that are told, and people who read those absorb that. And when we look at those grotesque carnivals, as Lawrence has named them, if you are a child and you're sitting on your parents' shoulders, your daddy's shoulders, and you're surrounded by your mother, your siblings, your grandparents, all the folks you know and love and respect, and there's so many other people around, everybody's having a picnic and they're dressed and they're having fun, while they're watching a Black man being murdered, then you don't grow up knowing that that's wrong. This is just the way things are. And that has to be countered. Somehow we have to make sure that people understand. And I think we're in a generation now where it is becoming understood. The scary part is you had nearly as many people vote for that racism that is intrinsic in the now leader of our country as those who voted for progress and for equity. That's scary. That's too many people. And then when you see all of the folks who showed up on January 6th to storm the Capitol, just take it over because it's theirs, the purpose was to eliminate the Black vote. And we can't let that go unpunished. We have partnered, we meaning the Black Archives, is partnered with the Equal Justice Initiative. And they have opened the Lynching Museum in Alabama. And so we are the Missouri site. So I went down to Springfield, Missouri, because they had a community remembrance project. And what those programs do is identify where people were victims of racial murder, lynchings, and then they collect soil from as close to where the body hung as possible. Put the soil in a jar, put the person's name and the date that they were murdered on the jar and where. I was just astonished to find out that 3,000 white people, 3,000 white people stood in the square, Springfield, Missouri, and watched two black men being lynched. And then it got so good to them, they went and got another innocent man. All three were known to be innocent at the time they were murdered. The next day, they lynched the third one. Not one person in 3,000 said, this is not right. We can't do this. So we have to stop that. We have to counteract that. And the only way that we could get to some kind of form of racial equity and justice is by saying, no, it's not right. We can't do this. And you have to let those old ways go. The night rioting and bulldozing from days of slavery, that's 200 years ago. Let it go. Let it go. Redefine yourself some other kind of way. If the only way that you can see purpose in your life and elevate yourself is through racist attitudes, then I think that's a sad commentary on you, what you think about yourself and what you think about your race and your people.
Okay, we're getting pretty close on time. A couple of questions I don't know if we can get to or not. Maybe try one more. Is the Black Archives accepting heirlooms, historical contributions, or should picture items be taken and the picture be contributed to the archives?
We don't accept copies, but yes, we are. We're building our collection. We're trying to fortify it. We are moving this place towards being a first-class research institution. We have had researchers from literally around the world, South Africa, China, England, and all across the United States. So we're gathering those artifacts, those documents, those things that somehow verify and enhance what we know about the building of Black America. So yes, if you have one, if you have some of those documents or artifacts, please.
Okay. And maybe we can get one more. Question is change better approach with the spirit of collaboration or confrontation? And that's the first phrase of that question. And then the second part is, are there circumstances that require one or the other?
I think I tried to make a point in my presentation that these were, that this progress and these steps were often multiracial. We had Harriet Tubman taking people to freedom from slavery, but she stayed at the farm homes and got help from white people. So yes, I think they are a collaboration. And we know that we can't get these things done in isolation. It should be a nationwide movement. But there are people that we have to confront. We cannot let people get away with this stuff. So whether it's one person or an organization or a group of people or a large conglomeration of folks saying, no, this is wrong, stop it, it has to be done. We cannot turn our backs. We can't put our heads in the sand. We can't act as if it didn't or doesn't or still doesn't exist. It does. It's real. And we have to confront that. And hopefully we can do it together.
Yes, we've got to do it together. And we have to bring all these things because if you look, we're repeating history. We're going backwards and probably 60, 70, maybe even 80 years backwards versus where we should be right now in 2021. We're fighting the same battles in very worse ways. And I think a lot of it goes back to educating starting with our kids and try to get people to understand that hate is wrong. And there's like one of the Martin Luther King quotes that I'll probably just paraphrase. I always mess it up, but I really like is the right time is always, it's always the right time to do the right thing. And there's not a non-right time to try to do the right thing. So Dr. Carmaletta, thank you. Enjoyed everything. We appreciated all your endeavors with this and work. And again, we'd like to thank Humanities Kansas for their support with this project, and thanks to the others that helped us out with the PowerPoint presentation earlier. Couldn't try to figure exactly where that was at. And so this is a first for the Gordon Parks Museum and the Forsyth Community College to have this webinar, an event like this. Of course, we'd like to have everything. We want to do what we traditionally do with the in-person events, but with COVID, we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep and ensure safety of the community and our students too as well. And so we want to thank all the participants for joining in, and hope you have a wonderful day, and can keep our country in your prayers and thoughts, and to try to keep peace going around. Thank you so much.
Get a chance, come visit the Black Archives of Mid-America in Kansas City.
Yes, and come visit the Gordon Parks Museum. We are open today if you're in the area till for visitors till 5 p.m. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.